After my review of Stanley Kubrick's Lolita, I was asked to follow up that review with the remake, which apparently follows the book much more closely and would help me to better appreciate the story. The movie was directed by Adrian Lyne, who also directed Jacob's Ladder. Lolita stars Jeremy Irons, Frank Langella, Melanie Griffith, and Dominique Swain. The story is the same as ever. A middle-aged man named Humbert comes to America, meets a widow while looking for a place to live, and falls in love with the widow's 14-year-old daughter. Just like with Kubrick's version, they had to increase her age from 12 to 14, but since this movie was made 25 years after Kubrick's version, it was much easier for them to get away with the more risque material. As a result, we get a much more explicit look at the implications of the story, as well as a new soundtrack by Ennio Morricone. In this version, we focus more on Humbert rather than Mrs. Hayes or Claire Quilty. Humbert is given a backstory which explains his pedophiliac tendencies, and while the original movie focused a lot of time on how James Mason's Humbert was gleefully using Mrs. Hayes to get to her daughter, it's really only referenced for the most part in the remake. Mason, while doing a good job, was almost cartoonish in his villainous apathy for Lolita's mother, laughing fiendishly while reading her letter confessing her love. By contrast, Jeremy Irons acts in a way that I thought was more realistic to his situation. And of course, he's a very good actor as well. Lolita's very different too. She's obviously a nymphette character, and it was very hard to determine how she felt about Humbert. Half the time she acts like a calculating adult, and the other half of the time she acts like a 6-year-old child. Though obviously that's the thing about having this story from Humbert's point of view, not to mention having her childhood innocence robbed from her. As for the rest of the cast, well, Melanie Griffith was given much less time to establish her character of Mrs. Hayes than the actress in the original, and it takes away from Mrs. Hayes as a character. Rather than being more of a comic relief, Claire Quilty is portrayed as a much more sinister character in the shadows, and the rest of the cast just fits in with their tasks. Watching this movie, it really speaks to the difference in time periods that both versions of Lolita were filmed in. Thanks to the more lenient censors, we get to see more uncomfortable aspects of this story that Kubrick was unable to include in his film. This makes Lolita all the more unpleasant in its dark story, and both versions manage that very well. I know some people disagreed with my opinion of the first film. I thought it was technically an interesting movie, but I found its subject matter repulsive, as I'm sure most people would. Maybe that led me to dislike the movie a bit too much, but it's really hard to stick with a 2-hour-long movie that continually makes you uncomfortable. Watching a 40-something man sexually corrupt a 14-year-old, regardless of how well acted or directed the movie is still a distasteful experience. However, one thing that separates Adrian Lyne's version from Kubrick's version is how there's an issue of guilt and regret placed into the story from Humbert's point of view. I won't say how or when it's implied, but the fact that Humbert recognizes his perversion for what it was added an interesting layer to his character. In his narrations, he sometimes talks as if he's defending himself in a courtroom, and the jury is made up of women. I didn't really get that conflict as much in the original film, and while that doesn't necessarily mean it's the better film just because of that, I found it a bit more interesting. But the thing is, having watched this remake and being able to reflect on the original film that Kubrick made, I can't say I regret watching either of them. As much as the pedophilia part of the story bothered me while watching it, I do think that both versions were well-made films. I think the remake, due to it being made in a more liberal era of censorship with better technology, ultimately serves as the better adaptation of the story. But Kubrick's version has its advantages too. All in all, these two movie versions of Lolita are certainly provocative and controversial. But that's part of the reason why they're so unforgettable after you see them.